Welcome, everybody. Good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started, and some other folks may trickle in. But it's good to see everybody here this morning. I'm Jack Ryan. I'm the CTO of Fingal. With me is...
I'm Wren Steitle. I work at Fingal as well. I'm one of the software developers.
Very good. I hope everyone's having a good DevCon. Our talk today, our workshop today, is going to be called The Sum of All Tiers. We're going to be talking about architecture. And so for our workshop this morning, we're not going to be doing any coding or looking at any proper tech stacks. We're going to be talking about every developer's least favorite thing to do, drawing diagrams before getting to work. All right.
Before we get started, I promise we won't kick you out. How many people in here are not developers, not in the code? So if you're not spending at least 70% of your time in the code, who's not spending 70%? Awesome. We love that you're here. One of the things that we want to impart with this workshop is how do you have the conversations around technology, and how do you have conversations about the direction of your technology? So many times you have a marketing team that's like, we sold you a horse, and you're like, that has a horn on it, that's a unicorn, and we don't have those. And so many times you have your dev team that comes back and they're like, I have made you the perfect hammer. It is the most amazing hammer in the world. And you're like, that's really great, but I asked you for a screwdriver. So how do you have the conversations to make sure that what you're building meets both needs? So what we want is more of a high-level overview. It's more of a way for us to look at what pieces of information do we need, how do we weigh those against each other, and what is the consequences of it when it goes right and when it goes wrong.
Awesome. Got our introduction slides coming up here, and you are first.
So the top picture is not me. The bottom picture is me. This is what I look like, especially sitting at my desk in the morning. It is my favorite picture of a Wren. My name is Wren Steitle. I entered tech in 2019, and I have been working in software security, legacy application maintenance, and upgrades, as well as working on building out in fintech with Fingal. So I come at the technology with a security mindset. How do we make sure that it is a quality application that's going to survive as legacy? We don't want to build something for right now that's going to break in a year. We want to build something that's going to be around for a while. Most of the applications I've worked with are older than solidly half of my children. So I have seen what bad architecture decisions look like 10 years down the line, and I've seen what good architecture decisions look like 10 years down the line.
Awesome. And I'm Jack Ryan. I'm one of Fingal's co-founders and its CTO. Been with the company for a little over 3 years now. We have a large API infrastructure that we run behind the scenes, lots of different interconnected parts. Made the push to microservices a couple of years ago, and we've been dealing with both the benefits and drawbacks of that decision ever since that day. And so, when we work at Fingal, we take the approach of trying to do our architecture and our user flows first before any code goes down. Which has helped us, at least in the last couple of years, to get a better idea of what sorts of decisions we make up front, what kinds of decisions can we defer, and what are the consequences of our decisions when we get down the line and have to look back in 6 months' time. So I'm going to start today with a quote. The quote is from Kevlin Henney, and it is, "A good architecture comes from understanding it more as a journey than a destination, more as an ongoing process of inquiry than as a frozen artifact." So architecture is difficult to talk about in software, in large part because it's really difficult to know what exactly it is. And I'm just going to ask the question to the group to get us started on the workshop. What is software architecture? Yes? Right, so that's a design of how the software has achieved its goals. Good. What else? What actually is it in the world? I'll call on people. Diagrams.net. So the answer here, right, is a difficult one. The truth is there's no such thing as an actual architecture. We're talking about software here. And software doesn't have a physical form. So when we look at like buildings or other sorts of places where architecture is very important, it's really easy to say just on even an initial appraisal, is the architecture of this building any good? You can say, well, it's got good foundations, the walls are gonna hold up, the roof's gonna stay up, yeah, the architecture's fine. Or it's not at all stable, it's going to crumble any day now. And most of us can see that just by looking at the building. With software, there is no physical form. So it's impossible to say, without really taking a deep look at it, whether or not the architecture is good, whether it solves the problem that it purports to solve well, and whether it will work in the long run. I gotta stop walking around this podium, or I'm gonna have to do it every time. Okay, so what we have here is a very, very basic sort of software architecture diagram, right? Where we've got a client computer, it's gonna connect to a web server. The web server is gonna connect to a bunch of application architecture. We don't really need to know what it is exactly, we just need to know that the pieces all fit together properly. And so we start with these diagrams. When we're making new products, we sit down as a team and we go, this is how it's gonna work. We've got everything we need here. And when we ship this to the client, we're gonna be done. We're gonna be able to wash our hands of it and say, this works right now, and then almost immediately you have to change it. Because of course you have to change it. And then you have to change it again and again and again until your architecture looks like that. And that's the natural process, right? Where we build something simple to begin with, knowing that we're going to have to change it as we go along, knowing that we're gonna have to add features, new services, new structures. And eventually down the line, you have these moments where your software engineering team sits down, looks at the application architecture and says, we can't change any of this stuff. It's all too interconnected. It's all too dependent on itself. How do we continue to scale when we've backed ourselves into this corner?
And while interdependent systems are not a bad thing, it does cause problems. And occasionally it causes you to have tears.
Indeed. So how many of you are actively working in software architecture, not just day-to-day coding, but building the systems and thinking about what they have to do broadly? Excellent. How many of you have a holistic architecture diagram for every service that you're running on your system? Yep, and that's what inevitably happens, especially, and I'll ask one more yes or no. How many of you are working for a startup? Awesome. So we've gone through exactly the same thing at Fingal, right? Where when we started out, we were direct to consumer, and what we were asked to do basically was run experiments with users and move really fast. So go out, do some customer research, figure out what people want, try to build a quick prototype for it, roll the prototype out, see if it works. If it doesn't work, tweak it. If it works, you're good. And you have these prototypes, and suddenly you're like, okay, now the prototype grows into an application. And once it grows into an application, are we gonna change that much about it? Probably. And you're left with these sorts of remnants of the early decision to not think about what the system was going to look like once it hit its final form.
I think for us, one of the biggest pain points was focusing very heavily on this is exactly what we need for this moment and not creating any wiggle room for what if it grows, what if it changes. And that left us a little bit painted into a corner that we had to figure our way out of. And that's kind of where the idea for this came from is we backed into a corner, let's impart our knowledge.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'll share my corner example first. And it's something that Fingal is actively working to solve right now. As I said, we pushed to a microservice architecture a couple of years ago. And all of our services are pretty well encapsulated, I would say. They relatively do what they purport to do and nothing additional on top of that. But as we move forward, we discover, right, that pieces from one of those application architectures, which is completely dissimilar and different from any of the other ones, now we want that over in application A. Because somebody over here is asking for it, we put it all the way over here, now we gotta go get it. And so what we've done at Fingal is we've created sort of this dependency net And it all has to move between the services, which means we've got to spend a bunch of time on code reviews and in debugging, looking not only at the code for the application that we are currently working on, but on the code for any of the applications it communicates with. Where we're saying, okay, I can change the response from this particular application and nothing in this code base breaks. But unfortunately, the other code bases communicate with this one over HTTP. And I can't test that behavior from in here. I got to go over to that other application and solve it. Now, obviously, right, it's nice that the logic for the broader system is broken into pieces, but at the same time, it means that you have to go and debug every single piece.
Yeah, and I think the canary in the coal mine for that example was how many times did I come to you and say, how does this connect? That was our like, okay, maybe we need to sit down and talk about this. My example doesn't actually come from Fingal. It comes from previous security work that I did. I had an application that I was in charge of bringing to current standards. It was a large application that started as a tiny one, and it was designed to be used by multiple agencies, and it was a system that could not go down for any reason, could not go down. And it was completely built on Web App 2, which is super great until Google killed it. And it also had a front end of Angular.js, which was super great until Google killed it. So what do you do when you have an application that is now disturbingly out of date? And the architecture decisions that they made there were great if you were sticking with Web App 2. But when you tried to move it, and the only acceptable choice based on the parameters and all of the chaos that was there was to move it over to Django. And so the entire framework and architecture style between the two is completely opposite. I mean, it's like cats and dogs. Like, yeah, they all have 4 legs and they all can run, but they do it very differently. And so we ended up having to figure out how to take an existing architecture and translate it into a new one, which came with many tiers, many tiers. So that was kind of what we saw, was that architecture, even when designed perfectly for that moment, doesn't mean it's going to stay there. Nobody knew that Google was going to kill Web App 2. Like, we never expected that, but they did. So we had to adjust accordingly. So even the best decisions in the moment are not necessarily going to last long term.
That's a very good point. And you know, I'll return to the quote at the top before we dig into the meat of the workshop. Architecture, you know, as Wren says, we're all in software, and software by its nature is going to change. So unlike building architects who can step back from their finished product, look at it and say, hey, we did a great job. Let's go build the next one. We have to look at it and say, all right, this works right now. And it's going to have to work as it gets used for new purposes, new reasons, new owners, again and again and again. So we have to build for change and not for finality, not for structure.
I would almost encourage you to think about your technology and your applications as people rather than thinking of them as buildings. So when you're talking about how you're going to grow this, think about it more like a person. I have a kid who has hated mango since the day that they were born. They feel it is a trash fruit, and I agree with them. Mango flavoring, great. Mangoes, not so much. But that has stayed the same. But this child also used to think that apples were the devil. And now I go through about 10 pounds of apples a week with this child. So some parts of it have changed, yes, and some parts have not. But much like a person, we always have the ability to continue growing and learning. An application is the same way. We can continue to grow our application. And my personal view is the day that you stop learning is the day that you die. So I think everything should be an ability to grow and continue, much like an application. It's never a static thing in a good application.
Absolutely. Does anyone have any questions before we dig into the workshop proper? All righty. So for today, our workshop is going to be about collectively creating, as a group with the people in this room, a software architecture diagram. And so Wren and I have come up with a couple scenarios that we are going to pose to this group. You may have stumbled across workshops like this. They often get called katas. We've got a couple scenarios for applications based on what we want them to do, how many people need to use them, and what the other parameters, if there are other parameters for the application, need to be. And so we're going to go through as a group and create this architecture diagram based on these stipulations and see if we can, and see what happens as we have to change it during our thinking about this in even just one session.
This is not going to be an exhaustive workshop. We're going to hit the high notes. And for the people who are in tech and who work in code, obviously we're all in tech, sorry. For the people who are in the code bases and really working on making these changes, I encourage you to listen to the people in the crowd who are non-tech, not in the code base, and hear the way that they will state something and see if there's a way that we can kind of find the middle ground between the two. And this way we don't end up with the perfect hammer and we don't sell a unicorn. So let's try and find a way between the two and high level this so that we can see what these conversations would look like, and you can extrapolate it out to your company and your individual circumstances to come up with a way to architect with all of the input that you need. So.
Absolutely. All right. I'm going to move this to the next slide, and then I'm going to grab my marker and my eraser and come around for the final time to the front here where I'm going to stand. All right, so I'm going to grab my architecture list with our scenarios, and we're going to jump into it. Now, I like Westerns, so every single one of the application scenarios that we've come up today is some sort of take on an application for a Western scenario. So that's what we're going to do. I'm just going to read the first one out loud verbatim. So we've got some stakeholders, right? And these stakeholders are asking us for an application as a software company, say. Cool. What they want is a bustling mercantile town along the railroad. We already have a railroad system, but the thing that they're noticing about this is that they are not great at predicting what the best place is going to be to found their town when they go out to do so. So they've asked us to build an application that can properly tell them where to erect this town to get the maximum amount of profit from railroad, from trade, all that kind of stuff. And so our job here is for, say, around, let's say, 50,000 users to start with. We need to build an application that's going to help them with geolocating this particular town somewhere in the world based on some parameters about a system that we don't control. I've started our architecture diagram. I think it looks pretty good right now. I think it's going to work, at least in the short term.
So we're done.
I think so. Yeah,
Cool.
I think we've done it.
Good workshop.
All right. So just start calling stuff out to me if you would. What do we need to worry about here? What are the not necessarily technological, although technological is fine, what are the product ramifications or conditions that we need to think about when we get started here? Yeah.
I mean, the most important thing for where to look at town is having water, and for the profit, having the scarcity of water around it.
Oh, that's interesting. All right.
Wow, both sides of the
Water.
same coin. Very nice. What other?
I would say the usable area, so calculating a function of like usable land to build on.
Okay, so our usable acreage. How many people can we fit on this space? Wonderful, the weather
cool.
conditions.
Yep.
Yeah, I'd really like to not be in a western town that gets a whole lot of rain because I really don't like mud. What else?
It's kind of silly, but geo conditions with the 50-year flood line,
Sure.
soil swelling.
So I don't know how many people here live in the Boulder or Denver areas, but we actually had a 100-year flood that happened
Flooded.
a couple of years ago, and it was something that so many neighborhoods didn't think about.
That's
And we ended
absolutely
up
true.
with millions and millions of dollars in a state that is technically considered borderline desert.
Yep. I mean, heck, it flooded last week.
Yeah.
So fires too.
Fires. Good point.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Kind of related to the geoconditions and geography.
Yeah.
Yep. Like
Geography.
topography, say. Yeah.
Distance from
Distance from, yeah, the distance from an existing town.
Awesome.
What kind of train is this? Do we need to care about refueling?
Wonderful.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably.
So why don't we just write that as like train needs or,
That's going to be complicated.
yeah? I mean, I'll toss this one in here
Yeah,
just because it
water's-
goes with train needs, and I
water's
feel like it may not get hit, but also like, how far are we from the train? Are we gonna build the train tracks through the center of the city, or are we gonna build it 10 miles away and you have to, you know, take a wagon in? What are we gonna do here? Train tracks exist. How far are we putting our city? Where are we
Yep.
doing this? Are we building
That's a good
around
point.
it, next to it, on top of it, underneath it?
Absolutely. All right, we've got a lot of product conditions here. To list the ones that we heard here, we've got position of the town relative to the train as it comes through. Location of water in the nearby area is going to be really important. Relative scarcity of water near the town so that there's nowhere else to go. Fire danger in the area. The usable area, just the size that we have to work with of this particular location, which ties in to some extent, right, with the topography. The topography is probably what's going to limit us on that front. Weather conditions and weather problems. Distance from other towns in the area. Geological conditions. And finally, the needs of the trains. So we've got a lot of different products here. Now, the first thing I think I want to do is which ones of these, and I think there are a couple, seem like they could be grouped. Or to put it another way, which ones of these are very obviously separate or different from our other concerns? Yeah,
I would say, like, you group resources, so like you want to have water and usable area.
sure.
Water, you kind of like on the plus side of it, maybe risks on the other side, the fires and ways that they're.
Absolutely. So let's mark our resources with a blue R. That's going to be scarcity of water and water for sure.
Train needs.
Yeah, train needs for sure. Usable area, absolutely. Is usable area the same as the other resources? It's farmland. That's a good point. Yeah. Well, and that sort of brings us to a different problem, which is usable area can mean something very different depending on what you're talking about using it for. All right, so let's just start with the resources. And I'm going to annotate the risks with a nice red R as well. And that's going to be weather risks, fire risks, geological condition risks.
Really quickly, is there anything on this list that you would put in the risk category that may have been also listed as a resource? Is there anything in here that you could see going into both categories?
Topography maybe, because that is a risk if you're near like a mountain.
Yeah.
Small landslides, but also it implies that it's flat and you have place room to grow, so.
Absolutely. Another one
No
that I
doubt.
would argue for is the scarcity of water could be listed as a risk too. What happens if the well that you're using runs dry? What happens if a rock slide happens and the spring that you were getting your water from is now an underground aquifer? What are you going to do?
I don't know.
So I would argue that it goes risk and resource in that case.
Absolutely. So these are, right, what we've put together here is basically a list of parameters, right? So these are things that we are going to need to collect and things that we're probably going to need to operate upon for our application to work. And so if we look at all of these particular needs, and all of these are going to be used in the calculation of whether or not this location is suitable or optimal, say, we've got to find a way to consider all of these without having an overly complicated architecture. So what is the best, in anybody's opinion, the best way to start in on this? What seems like the most obvious entry point for our architectural diagram? Where's the data come from? Very good. So I'm going to use this just kind of vertically, and we'll start down here and just draw that nice familiar database symbol. That's kind of what it looks like, right? Yeah, absolutely. Data collection and data persistence is going to be important, right? And so question for everybody here. At this stage in the journey, do we need to pick a database? No, we don't. In fact, we may not need to pick a database until we're all done with this stuff. Do we need to pick any tech decisions, any stacks, any sort of technology, any frameworks right now? Nope. All right, so we're good to go. We know that we have some kind of input source that's going to read into our system in a way that we will be able to collect this data. Awesome. What's another entry point? I can tell you, I would argue the number one entry point that we should all be thinking of is the user. So on exactly the opposite side of the stack, when we have a user come into this application, they're going to be looking for something. And I mean, we've promised them that we're going to deliver them something, so we probably should have something they can use. And now there's all this stuff in the middle. So what are we going to do about the middle? How are we going to organize all of this data intake into something that's readable and usable for our consumer? Yeah.
Talking about interface or like logic?
Any of the above. So it's a good point. We probably need an interface, and we probably need a logic layer, and they do probably need to be separate.
I think, we're going to have some sort of analysis model, like a model of scoring or just saying, is this a good place or a bad place?
Gotcha. Cool. So let's just put that into our logic layer as an analysis module. Sorry, come again? Well, now that's a question, right? Go ahead.
You're talking about two different forms of data at that point. So you have your user data coming in, which is saying, these are my needs, these are my parameters. And then we also have the data coming in that the user doesn't see, which is, what pieces do we need to evaluate and give them a reply? So the user will have to give us some data. What do they want? How much space do they need? Something. We're going to need to know some parameters. We can't read their mind. So we will need to know that. And that is a very good point, that how are we getting that data in? What are those parameters going to look like? And what are we going to ask of them?
Your constraints around your users, are they on the train track? Sitting in an office?
Yeah?
Great question. We didn't really think about this before we dove in, did we? Who are our customers? Who's using this application?
How are they getting to that?
Right. Let's just ask it, because we've got, so the other thing that we're talking about, right, I'm just going to drop that because I can't reaffix it there. We've got our logic module, and we know we need to do some kind of analysis in here on our inputs. And so that analysis, as we heard it, will have, it sounded like a Boolean, right, to say true, false, is this a good spot? Depending on our user, is that how we want to frame the return of this particular module? So let's rephrase our architecture here a little bit with our user case as a stipulation. Let's start with, say it's somebody who is on the train and is, moving along the tracks out in the world and actually actively sort of surveying. Say they're a surveyor, right? And they go to places and they try to evaluate the place. In that situation, our Boolean logic is going to be really nice, right? They're going to be able to get off the train, stop in a spot, pull up the application, check to see if the spot is good, immediately get a yay or nay, and then get back on the train if it's a nay and move on to the next spot. That's awesome. That's going to be really easy to use.
Now,
But say it's someone who's not on the ground, right?
I would argue that it's a completely different use case for somebody who's sitting in the fancy pants of New York City, and they're getting ready to go off and build themselves a town. Their parameters could be potentially very different, where instead of saying, is this good? Yes, done. They could walk in and say, let's find the optimal along the way. So it does depend heavily on use case.
Absolutely. So question for the group. Say we do have 2 use cases there. How do we handle that? What are we going to do with our architecture to account for 2 separate use cases of the same tech? Yeah.
Or like 2 journey maps?
2 journey maps. That's a great idea. And so let's work that into our diagram somehow. Let's make sure that we understand that that's coming from there. And I'm just going to use this blank spot in here for our next step. So we've got our analysis module, which is running somewhere down here. It's going to feed some data up into this. And at that point in time, we're going to need to use that data to try to evaluate, right, what's the person doing with what our analysis module has output. And so I think the key here, and anybody correct me if I'm missing something, but I think the key here would be we don't need to change the analysis module. It can run exactly the same way for both of those use cases. We just need to change the point in the stack where we determine what the outgoing product is going to be. And because that's a user-based decision, right, and not necessarily anything that should necessarily, right, compromise the underlying logic of our application, we can foist that up the stack into a spot where we could change it at any time or add additional use paths without having to go into our analysis module and rip it out and start over from scratch. And so let's just call this little box use cases here. And so the use cases can feed our interface, and we've got a nice separate place in our application architecture where we can go to say, all right, we've got our data from analysis. Let's format it the way that we want to see it.
Are you making an assumption that your use case is feeding your decision engine, analysis engine, whatever?
That's interesting. So the question was, are we assuming that the use case is feeding back into our analysis engine? Is that correct? Excellent point. So let's dig into the analysis engine, right? First and foremost, do we want users to influence how the analysis engine runs?
I see some heads shaking, or nodding, sorry, not
Are you
shaking.
saying like they actually give, they give input on the parameters? Because like, wouldn't it just be like one equation? We would have like different stats for whatever the different options are,
Sure.
right? And then they can just mess with the parameters that go into that, but they can't like just define their own stuff from their client side.
Interesting. So the statement was, if we have users able to specify their own parameters, are they going to be able to change, truly change how the analysis runs based on customizable options that they might have? Do we let them add options to the analysis engine that are custom for their use case, or do we just let them fiddle with what we've already given them, right? Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, we could add it later if they need something specific.
Sure.
Yeah, I just think that you would just have like the analysis engine just be, always calculate scores from certain parameters, and you can mess with those parameters if you want, and then the interface is just like how you present it to the user.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I was just gonna say that, actually coming up with the analysis engine, I think that there's kind of a problem there because maybe we're not the most qualified people to decide like which places are the best.
No.
So maybe we try to do something more simple and just have it just be Boolean, and they can pick what they care about. In fact, it could even be an app where the surveyors are filling it in. For them.
Interesting.
So, like, we're really just providing them a place to originate and store data and maybe display it in a way that's useful.
Interesting. All right. So,
Actually influencing what the logic should be.
right.
So to sum that up, in case anyone didn't hear it, and to make sure I heard you correctly, you're saying that maybe we have something that allows the surveyors to input information, and instead of us making the decision on if this is a good place or not, that we would present the information and let people make their own decision based on their needs?
Yeah.
Okay.
And if we wanted to be really basic about it, I mean, it could be so much as just a surveyor writing down what they thought. I mean, that's
Right.
like totally
Yeah.
free text, not quantitative at all, purely qualitative, but it might do what we want to do.
Absolutely.
That brings up a really interesting point of if we are creating logic, what are our biases in that logic? What are we bringing to it and saying, well, I think this is important. I think it's really important that you have trees in that area. Are trees really important if you're farming? Depends on what you're farming. But I think trees are really important because I really love squirrels. So am I bringing a bias and saying that this place here is really not a good option because there's not a tree for 10 miles? Potentially.
That's very interesting. So, I mean, right, within 20 or so minutes, we need to revise our use case, thinking about this application. So we might need to go back, right, and say, if we're just running an MVP, if we don't need to build some big, massive system right out the gate, what if we just let the surveyors collect the data, feed that into our engine, and then we can display the data to them, and they're professionals, they'll make the decision for us. We just need to give them something that they can use.
If you were to boil this down to the bare minimum MVP, what would that look like in 2 sentences or less?
A place for you to enter a latitude, a longitude, and your comments on that location for somebody else to read.
A place for you to enter a latitude and a longitude and your comments for somebody else to read. Anyone else? No? All right.
Sounds good.
Yeah? So are we all happy with latitude, longitude as input?
I'm very happy with it.
All right. Let's scrap this.
I mean, I love me some good data, so I am here for latitude and longitude. The precision is wonderful, so I'm happy with it. But is there any other way that we could, how would we know if that's the best approach? Yes, talk to a customer. Who are our customers again? Yeah, people with way too much money who really, really want to go live in a Western town that they haven't built yet.
This easel's really hard to erase on. It's not very stable. I don't think it was architected correctly.
This is why architecture matters. No. Okay, so we have now hit a point where we said a bunch of grand things that we wanted. We wanted to enter different inputs. We wanted to look at different factors. We said, okay, all of these factors are really important. What are we going to do about it? And then we went ahead and we divided them into our resources and our risks. So we took our resources and our risks, which some of them did overlap along the way, which is perfect because some things do in life get a little bit interconnected. And then we said, well, maybe this is getting too complicated. Who is this for? We stepped back, we looked at our user, and we said, what are they trying to do? And then we talked through a couple of different solutions. We arrived at a solution of maybe we just step this back from having multiple use cases and people in New York who are looking at this and people on the train who are inputting data about this location. We stepped it back to a more basic version where we said, okay, what about if we just have a place for people to enter latitude, longitude, and notes on that area, and then they can submit that, other people can see it and make decisions. So that's where we are now.
Awesome. So we're going to take those inputs. Those inputs we now know, right, based on that, we know that we're going to need to surface this user data to other users. So at this point, we can really start to look at a service level architecture and say, what kinds of things are we going to have to do here to facilitate the ability for one person to read this stuff? And so now, right, we've got our interface. We know we can enter lat, long, and comments. Probably we're going to need to display those to users. Do we want to display them when the people are at the coordinates, or is it a library that you can look through?
What are the benefits of having it at the coordinates?
Yeah.
I think there's none because they wouldn't have any comments yet in theory.
Okay.
Unless you're saying multiple people are going to visit there.
Right.
Yeah, so I think that it would basically just be like you put them in and it stores to a list or like a map of just like what coordinates, what spots they're going to use.
Awesome.
So you're talking about asynchronous. We're not expecting people to use it while they're at the location. We're expecting them to come back later?
Comments while they're there, but also like,
Okay.
I don't know how old school, I don't know what time period we're studying this in, but it's hard for me to imagine there's extensive cell phone service.
That's a good point.
That's a fair point.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, I mean, we're also designing an application for people to build a Western town. I'm pretty sure that Western towns are a little bit out of vogue right now with the millennials, but it's all good. So I think we're kind of suspending reality and going Hollywood on this one.
You're also making some assumptions, everybody knows what latitude and longitude they're setting at right now.
Very
Yeah,
good.
fair enough.
Very good.
Locations on that basically, or
So
something.
you start limiting your devices that you can either interact with, or you have to have really smart people in great maps.
Yeah. Yeah, you're also assuming that everybody has properly calibrated information so that they can tell what latitude and longitude they are. You're assuming that everybody has that equipment, that all of your people are at the level where they can afford that equipment to get exact latitude and longitude to a certain extent versus, I don't know, I'm about 7 miles west of the Mississippi. So you're assuming that your people have a certain amount of precision in it.
Absolutely.
Maybe we just get the location from the train company.
Get the location. I mean, yeah, why not, right? They probably know.
Yeah?
Where the train stop?
Yeah, that's actually a really good idea. Okay, so we have a train. This is a way that we could homogenize our information input is we have this beautiful train and the train tracks are not going to move. I mean, unless there's a rock slide, the train tracks are not going to move on us, right? So why are we not utilizing this piece and leveraging it to give us a more comprehensive data set? So that train knows how far outside of the city it is. So if you say, I stopped 7.3 miles outside of Wichita, then it's going to be the same 7.3 miles outside of Wichita because it's the same train tracks.
Just have the driver check this guy sounds stupid with the odometer.
There you go. I don't know what's on a train.
Right?
I don't know what's on a train. Fun fact though, I was at one point in a mock trial where I was convicted for hitting a car with my train. So, fun fact.
Wouldn't that be the car's fault?
No, actually, they decided it was my fault because I didn't have the light on. Fun fact, you have to have your light on when you're driving a train. I didn't know this. It was the middle of the day. But no, I was helping out the law team over at DU, and so I was a mock train conductor. I did not serve jail time.
All right, we got a nice big library then of positions, not necessarily lat-long positions, but positions along the tracks. So we'll just call this positioning.
Now, if we're using our positioning along the tracks, what could be one of our limiting factors or one of our conditions that we wanted to consider that we could be limiting by using train tracks?
I think we still need to like have something, where we say, at least have a compass, like, a mile northwest of mile marker 7 on the train track or something like that, because we don't necessarily want to build right next to the train track. And if we just say, well, I took like 50 steps away from the train track, that might be a little too ambiguous.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have T-Rex arms for legs, and other people have normal length legs. So my 50 steps is not anyone else's 50 steps. But this also brings up a really good point, too, of one of the things that we had considered, which got removed, was how far away from the train tracks are we going to build this town? If we're using our train tracks, could we potentially be limiting our data input by saying it has to be on the train tracks?
Yeah. Cool. So we know we need to take position and comments into effect. We know that we're going to have to spend some time trying to figure out how to properly calibrate positioning. And right, that the nice thing about architecting up front, one of the points I want to drive home here, and this feels like the opportune moment to do it, is that when you architect up front, as you work through it, and I encourage it to always do it with a team. These sorts of things, if you do them alone, you will build the perfect architecture, and then you will show it to somebody else and they'll say, excellent, but. So what we get when we do these sorts of things is we very quickly, as a group of engineers, particularly engineers, but also product people and salespeople, we can very, very quickly arrive at a point where we can say, I know where the challenge here is going to be. I know what we're going to have to spend time building. And I know where we can, where we have tech that we're going to need that we can sort of say, all right, let's not do that right now. Let's focus maybe on some of the more key aspects of this application that we know are going to be difficult to put together. And so one of the big strengths, right, of doing this up front is that in addition to helping you have that architecture diagram from the get-go, having something nice that you can refer customers and salespeople and product people and new devs to say, this is what the application looks like, do you have any questions? You also wind up actually building your roadmap ahead of time. You can actually sit down and say, here's the list of issues that are going to emerge from this process, and now I can start to write tickets for them and maybe even try to start sizing them just based off the architecture conversation.
One of my favorite things to do at Fingal is to poke holes in things. And I am very good at it. I am very good at finding ways to break things. And it is essential to have somebody on your team who is willing to say, well, what about if I did that? Or what about if I moved it the wrong way? Or I wanted to use it in this other way? Or I warped it like this? Because what that does is it allows us to see what's more important based on what shifts and what changes along the way. So really kicking the tires of your idea is never a bad thing. It is never a bad idea to have somebody say, where do you think the pain points are? What do you think the problem is? Because there have been times where Jack will come with this beautiful product and say, this is what we need right here. This is our hammer. It's absolutely perfect. And then I'll go try and use it and I'm like, oh, but it doesn't work for this scenario. It's perfect, but it's not for this scenario. So having somebody from multiple viewpoints who can look in and kind of kick the tires of that idea will really help you to build a better, stronger product. Just in this conversation, we went from, oh, we're gonna input 2 different ways to, well, why do we need to do that? That introduces a bias that we didn't need to have. So we already identified a pain point of, we are biasing this and we are potentially limiting sites because we don't think they're good enough, but somebody else could. So that's why we want to kick the tires. That's why we want to have those multiple inputs. That's why it's so important to have all of your team in it.
Yeah, and I mean, it's worth noting, right, again, we have not chosen any technologies. We don't have a code stack. We don't have any frameworks. We don't have any database decisions because that's not really the purpose of architecting. Up at the head of the hour, you can defer on all of those choices. And having gone through it now for the last 4 years, I will tell you, defer for as long as possible on any of those big choices. Kick the can for as long as you can, reasonably, right? You don't want to be in a situation where it's like, we're go live tomorrow and we haven't picked a database. Okay, now we've got problems. But if you can defer that decision as long as possible and focus on what you need your app to do and not how you need to do it, then when it comes time to make that decision, that big architectural sort of like, oh man, I got to choose a web framework, here we go. You have all of the data to make that decision correctly, rather than getting to that point in the road, which, I mean, it's what we did when we built MVPs at Fingal to begin with, where you'd hit that fork in the road and you'd look at it and go, oh man, we already made all these tech decisions at the start of our project. We're already built all the way through on this stack. It's going to take us months to rip any one of these pieces out of here. And it's not going to work for this use case. We need to do something different with it now.
I mean, my key role at Fingal for the last year has been whispering over meetings, this is a perfect use case for SQL. But we made an architectural decision and used a NoSQL database. And now we are looking at what is this going to look like if we do switch to SQL? What are the benefits? What are the costs? So hopefully soon I will not be whispering in the back of the meeting, this is a perfect use case for SQL. And I'll have to find some new catchphrase. But that's just a real life example of what this is going to look like when you do it. And just to be clear, there is a very big difference between painting yourself in a corner and saying, I only need this data right here, and saying, I don't need to architect tomorrow's problem until I have today handled. So we are not saying only these pieces. We're saying these are the pieces we need right now. And that is a fine line to walk, and I fall on the wrong side of it quite often. So, yeah?
How many people here have worked at fintechs where you need to roll out MVPs really, really quickly and test them against users? couple people. This looks like an MVP to me, right? Where you're saying we could get this done pretty quickly and start testing it in the real world. And so the next question I would have for the group is this extensible? No reason why not, right? It very well might be. There's no reason to think that it wouldn't be.
Have we painted ourselves into any corners? Is there any piece of this that you feel like could not be extended, changed, or grown?
Extensible how? I mean, are you looking for the top 5 locations?
Well, there's a question, right? So a couple of things that spring to my mind is, first, what happens if you have conflicting comments? If you have two people who have gone to the same site and mutually reviewed it, I mean, even to take a step back, is that permissible? Do we let people do that? Or do we have some sort of proximity module that says, you're too close to a site that already got surveyed, you're not doing it again?
And with that, do we only want one survey, or do we want to get more than one opinion? How many people look at one Google review on something or one Amazon review? And how many people scroll through a solid chunk of the list?
I think that kind of gets to kind of deeper question about software. So, software, is a way to like gather originated information and then kind of feed it back to the business and the stakeholders. And like, if we enforce a rule where you can't have 2 people survey the same site, now we're starting to like put our own model on it. I mean, I personally like to leave that on the stakeholders and the business to decide all of those rules and just give them a tool to organize that information. So I would say just leave that. I don't think we should apply a rule to that. Maybe we give them the functionality if they ask for it specifically and they pay enough money for it and all that.
Yeah. And how many times have we had an area that had a 100-year flood? Does the topography look exactly the same as it did before that flood? So how old is that survey? When was it taken?
That's true.
Also, if you're asking me to survey and it's raining, I'm going to give you a very, very sad answer because I am secretly a cat and I don't like rain. So if I have to get off that train in the rain and go survey, you're going to get a probably dour sounding comment from me. But if it's bright and sunny and I've just eaten and I feel really good because I'm caffeinated, you're going to get a happier one from me. Mm-hmm. So comments are inherently biased.
Yeah. Well, and you raise a really good point about extensibility particularly, right? So say we had the system and we said, just out the gate, we can't have 2 reviewers review the same spot. When we get a situation and the product case arises and somebody says, hey, I want to have multiple reviews on the same spot. Well, heck, we got to go into the service architecture and enable that because we did a bunch of custom code to make it impossible. Now we got to go all the way to the core of this application and change how it functions. Versus if we enable multiple comments from the get-go, and then we have a stakeholder come in and say, I don't want to have all these comments on the same site, we don't necessarily have to change our core, right? We can add a module to it that says, look, let's just add a configurable on top of this that on those post requests to create those commentary reviews, we can block them on a client-by-client basis based on a proximity thing. So now we're adding a service, adding a feature, and leaving the core of our application alone. So we know and we have some confidence as engineers at that point, okay, we can do this, and we're not going to break anything in the core for anyone else who's using it right now, because we're not going to need to touch the core.
Another use case for that would be, let's say we have 2 customers. One of them is on our free tier, and so we only show them the one review, the most recent review or survey of that area. But let's say that they decide that they want to go for our platinum tier, and so we're going to show them every single survey from that site sorted by date order so that they can kind of see the progression of them. Did we break anything by keeping all of those surveys and simply only surfacing the one based on the user type, or are we just adding a piece of logic on top to only surface what we need? I guess it's the same question.
That's an important factor, though. If you're selling this to multiple customers, or you're doing it for like one.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
You really, if they're
Absolutely. Yeah, so his point was if we have one customer versus many customers, the application's going to change, right? Say we're selling it to the railroad or to the, US survey, we probably don't need to worry about multiple stakeholders with different product cases. But if we're selling it at large and going out into the market and saying, hey, anybody who needs this kind of tech can integrate with us, then we have a different sort of product architecture, most likely.
I would argue that keeping all of those surveys and not limiting them to one per area has an added benefit. This is why I'm really good at poking holes in things. Let's say that survey company A did 50 surveys for us and come to find out that they're fraudsters and they don't know what they're doing and they used crayons on all of them and they just made up the data and put smiley faces on there. We can then go through and limit those out. Have we completely broken our functionality? Do we have these giant black holes in our map where we can't tell you anything about it because those were the areas that company A surveyed? Well, no, we have other pieces. So yeah, we're gonna have some areas that we may not have data for now because we don't really want crayon in our database, or in our information at all, but we will still have overlapping data to the best of our ability.
All right. I think I'm at a point where I'm ready to throw a wrench in it.
Let's throw a wrench. Which wrench? What wrench do you want to throw in? Who
we
are we
want-
throwing it
I
at?
think we want bad actors.
Ooh, I love it. I actually didn't think about that.
Well, that's exactly right. We've gone for a creative sort of use case based on my obsessions. But the problems that we're talking about here are problems that real world applications are solving for right now, right? And it's a complicated case of, right, when you're in the marketplace and you're trying to figure out what kind of product you can build and how big it needs to be, how many choices do we need to make up front to start rolling this product to people, you have to think about all that complexity and what could happen theoretically, feasibly in the long run is going to influence how your application and how your product sells. And so it's really, really important, right, to say, yeah, we're going to have a really simple application architecture to get started with, but we know about all of this other stuff. We know it could happen, and we're ready for it. We think that what we've got is going to be able to adapt to that.
Mm-hmm. I'm confused. Which one are we doing? What's the title?
What is the title?
Because we gave everything fun titles like the mayor says the future is coming and Westward to the Wagons. And my personal favorite is Armadillo Falls to Plague. That was my input.
Let's go with Circle the Wagons.
Circle the Wagons. We're doing it.
So everybody in this room, I take it, is probably a fintech developer or a developer in the financial space, right? So you're all worried about security, I hope, and all thinking about locking things down. So we've got this nice application architecture right now. We've got all these nice survey sites. Let's say a group of bad actors begins to use this application and begins to pull the data from here to say, I bet there are going to be people at the nice spots. So let's go there and take their stuff. Now we've got an open API for our MVP. We've got to lock this stuff down. So how do we go about starting our process of adding authentication to this sort of thing? Blockchain. Excellent.
Oh, I love it.
That'll solve it. Blockchain.
Yes. Wonderful. Yeah. So, what are we trying to solve for? What's our problem so far? Can anyone sum it up as to what are we now trying to architect? Data leakage issues. Great. Love it. So we have data leakage issues. What are we gonna do? Our goal is to stop the data leakage. So what do we do?
Source of identity.
Source of identity.
Yep.
I love it.
And where do we enforce that identity? On users who are consuming or on users who are uploading?
Current issue is people are consuming.
Right. So let's just start there. And so let's add another service down here, and we'll call this, we'll just call it identity management.
What do we need for identity management? What pieces do we think are going to be important for us to figure this out?
Roles and responsibilities.
I'm sorry, one more time?
Roles and responsibilities.
Roles and responsibilities. Okay.
Absolutely.
What pieces do we need from an input to figure these out? A unique ID. Okay. Now, this is going to be one of those use cases where you may have to sit down as a company and say, do we want to reinvent the wheel? Are we going to create our own version of authentication, or are we going to use something off the shelf? So this would be a time for some research in a company. This would be a time where you would step away and you'd say, okay, well, what are the pros and cons of us building our own? What are the pros and cons of using one that's already out there? Between using our own, building our own, and using one that's out there, what preference do we have? Huh? Off the shelf. Yeah. I mean, this is not nuclear bombs. Like, we are not doing anything that it has like government secrets in it. Our risk level of somebody deciding to hack into it while there is not super, super high at this point. So an off-the-shelf solution does make a lot of sense here. So we get an off-the-shelf one. We get a box, IKEA style, and we're going to implement it. Which one are we going to go for? How are we going to pick the one? We need what? What are our factors for making this decision? We need identity. We need roles and responsibilities. So what might we consider in that? Where are we going to store this? What are we going to store?
So Ren brings up a good point here, right? Which is, as you're architecting, and this obviously is particularly salient with authentication, don't build your own. Pick one. And so there are some things that right away you will know as a software engineer, like we're gonna use a service for this on some level, right? We're not gonna build this in-house. And it's important to know what you need it to do up front and potentially down the line in order to make that decision correctly.
Yeah, like a secret word, something, yeah. So at this point in architecture, we don't need to solve the problem, but we need to keep in mind, how many types of users are you going to have? Like, are you just going to have like, I am authorized, I am not? Or are we going to have levels? Are we going to have different types along the way? So that's something that you would consider with this, because you may find service A has a better reputation, but only allows you to either be an admin or a user, and that's it. Or you may decide that option B has more customizability for saying, I'm a platinum tier, I'm a gold tier, I'm a silver tier, I am a peasant tier user.
So to pull from personal experience on the auth front, our authentication at first was user password because we were client-facing. We were just user-facing. Then we went B2B, so we switched over to OAuth 2 for a client credentials flow on the backside. That works great and has continued to work great for a really long time. And then we come to this point where our clients who are authorized on our system, authenticated through that system, they've got customers. And the customers aren't users, they're organizations. And so now the clients are coming to us saying, hey, I know that my authentication governs the data that I get back from your system, but now I need to segment that further down and permission it further down, because now I've got users who are using my system using your system. And they can read for other customers of mine because your auth is too broad. And so now we've got to go in and say, well, the client credentials is for one client and we issue it to the top level org. So unless we issue a separate client to each of their customers to build a different version of the API that they have to consume us on different credentials, we need now to solve this problem. right? Or to wildly complicate our customer's application, which, I mean, let's be honest, they're probably not going to do it. They're probably just going to say, that's fine, we'll find a different solution.
It's like a nesting doll of authentication. And explaining that to your developers before a 3-day weekend is a bad idea.
And so, right, the key, really genuinely the key with any of this stuff is when you set out to make these decisions, you have to know that they're going to change. And you always have to remember that they are going to change. So, yeah, you know, from every portion of the stack, from your authentication and your identity management to how you organize your interface, you can't rely on any of that being done and dusted. Even auth, right, which feels like something that honestly would never change, where you might look at that up front and say, the auth is what it follows an industry standard. We're never going to need to look at it again. It'll be fine. It may not. And the other thing, right, to remember, and particularly for fintech devs and startup devs, is, right, the scenario that we're pitching here where you've got bad actors trying to use your advice, that's a crisis for the business. And it's really, really easy in those moments of crisis, especially at a startup. And they're not always bad actor moments of crisis, right? Sometimes it's just like, oh man, we gotta fix something really fast, or oh man, we gotta build something for a feature that we gotta get out to somebody really quick, or we're gonna miss this opportunity. Those moments arise all the time. I mean, constantly. There's always something going on, right? And if you take all of this and you throw it out as soon as one of those crises arises, and you say, this is all nice during peace times, but now we're at war, and we can't be focused on all this stuff. We just got to roll stuff out and make sure that we patch up these problems that we've got. It might work in the short term, right? Your problem might go away, and then you might be left with an application architecture that completely by accident, because you were in a rush that week, stays with you for the next, what has it been, 3.5 years?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you end up with me having to talk to Jack again, like over Slack. How do I do this again? Because this one's different than that one, and you end up with complications that you didn't need. So, yeah, we have 20 minutes left. Do we want to do lightning rounds?
We can do some lightning rounds. Go ahead and pick one.
All right. So we're going to take you out of the architecture for a minute, and we're just going to, out loud, talk through what would be some potential solutions / thought processes, poke holes in these. So take our original application. We've got this beautiful thing. We've solved for all of our problems. Our life is perfect, rainbow, sunshine, everything looks amazing, and it works perfectly. We now have users who log in, who can look and decide where to put a town along the railroad, how far away they want it to be. They get the information. Life is good. It's perfect. It's exactly what we need. So it has now been 20 years of us using this application. People have made all sorts of cities along the rail line. We're doing the good, the bad, and the elderly.
Very good.
We had way too much fun with this. So you have all these people who are using your application. Now you have users who are using the old version of your application, using authentication along the lines of sending a messenger pigeon. So, or they're using the antiquated version. What do we do when we need to start updating? Because apparently there's new technology coming along, like the automobile, or in the case of tech, like, what is it, Web3? Yeah. Yeah, don't explain that before a 3-day weekend either. Otherwise, I turn it into a 4-day weekend. I did. So you have all these things. They're no longer going to be in compliance. Your application is not Web3 compliant by any means. It's not ready to go. It's not going to be. It's never going to be. It's not going to happen. What are we going to do? You still have users on this. What do we do? Jack, what's your first thought?
Well, I mean, think about, right, so the question here is effectively, right, sunsetting and figuring out how to treat old applications. So The first thing is you hope that you did it right from the beginning, at least to some extent, so that if you do have to make changes on a legacy application, it's not going to completely destroy it from the ground up. The second thing to consider, obviously, is backwards compatibility, right? And how do we take this system and perhaps integrate it into something that's newer? But the point that you raise, right, is particularly topical just because if anyone's working with web tech and building for the internet, which I imagine everybody here is, the dependencies that our applications sit upon change constantly. And usually in relatively minor ways, right, that we don't have to worry about terribly much. But sometimes one of those changes is the result of a major security flaw. And to leave the system out there, so right, say it's a legacy system and it's got a huge, huge glaring security hole in it. Anyone who's using it is wildly unsafe. It's not responsible for us to leave that application in service, right? If we leave that for consumers, then we're tacitly agreeing to build something unsafe that people should not be using. So we've got to find an elegant way to sunset it. How are we going to do that?
My first question is, does it need to be sunset? That's my first question. Are you actually taking an application? If it is still in use, that should have been your red flag, that it is still in use. Why is it still in use? Well, it's been 20 years. Have we built every single town that people want to build along the railroad? Or is it now that people are using it for other things? Like maybe they're using those because there are points along the whole state of Kansas where within 20 miles of that railroad, there's also now Route 66. I don't know if that goes through there. But maybe there's other use case for it, and that's why it's still in use. Maybe we're not building railroad towns anymore, but the word still in use should be a red flag for why are we sunsetting this? Is there a good reason for it? And sometimes the answer is this is going to hurt our wallet, but no, we really don't need to sunset this. We need to update it. And sometimes the answer is going to be it's just a Python application that's checking to see if the lights are still on and it's not an actual user. So your first thing that you should do would be to say, why are we sunsetting it? Why is it still in use? And make sure that you're not just chasing shiny new at the expense of your customer base that you built up.
And so a call out here, is this an engineering discussion that you would have? Probably at least in part, right? But
Well-
not really.
That decision should, in my mind, never be made by your engineering team alone. It should never, because your engineers will not necessarily have the right information from your product team about that particular tiny facet of what you're doing to say, well, no, the customers don't ever use it. And then you talk to your product team and they're like, oh no, we still have this one client who absolutely loves it. And this is the client that, pays us monthly and have been a loyal customer for this long and have brought us additional business. Are we gonna burn that bridge? I would argue that we probably shouldn't. So I firmly believe that any decisions around legacy applications being sunset versus upgraded versus kept static should always be made with every facet of the business in mind, because no one has all the answers.
Yeah.
And that
so-
comes from having dealt with legacy applications and accidentally shutting down one that you're not supposed to.
But the moment once you publish your APIs, you promise you support it, and then you cannot expect your customers to migrate. So you always build backward compatibility there, and in our master, we are not able to say or sunset this local method.
Yeah.
Very true. Okay, so the point there was that when you build an API, once you publish it, you are officially promising to support this API, and you cannot just sunset it, and you should build for backwards compatibility. What about if it's a security flaw that can't be overcome by updating a library or by fixing a method? What if it is a true flaw that cannot be overcome? That's when you get to those fun decisions where you have to get all the product.
And it becomes a business discussion, right? And that really is the point to be made here, is that it feels at first like a technical discussion. I know I've been through this. I imagine a lot of people in the room have been. tech will accidentally obsolesce sometimes. You don't know that it's happening as it's happening, and then you'll hit these moments where you're like, oh, that API, we built that 3 years ago and no one used it then. You want to use it now? It doesn't really work. I wouldn't. Because we haven't been looking at it, right? We haven't been actively developing on it, so we can no longer say for sure if it does what the customer is looking for it to do today. But it's an excellent point, especially in the fintech space. And at Fingal, we work with banks and credit unions. If you ship a piece of code to a bank or a credit union, it really can't change probably for the next 10 years. Depending, right, obviously depending on the deal, depending on what you're building, where you're building it. But in a lot of cases, you're building into architecture that has been around for a really long time, and it does not change that much. And particularly in those cases where you're working with institutions, you have to be able to promise that your tech is going to go unchanged from when you ship it for quite a long time. And right, that's another situation where having good architecture up front is going to go a really long way for you. Because then, right, if you've planned everything out ahead of time, it's less likely that you will have to ship, anything that is a major breaking change. It's not impossible, but it's less likely.
Go back to the question you asked. Can you give me an example where something like security would have to change the API because we're talking about the interface. Behind the interface, it's not visible.
So,
can you give me an example
yeah.
where you do see that really for example?
Yeah, I have a legacy application that cannot be taken down, cannot be taken offline for any reason, and we're currently pulling an Indiana Jones with it and trying to hopefully not end up being squished by a boulder, TBD. But one of the pieces calls out to a service that is not ours. We have no control over it, and that service is being, has a vulnerability that is not acceptable for the security level required for this user. This user is not a normal user. It is a more secure user than usual. This application is. And so when they call out to this API that is a vital piece of a logic that they do, that I'm trying to describe this without saying it. This piece that we call out for is required. It is absolutely the backbone of a big facet of the work. But that application is not in compliance with the security level that they need. And so now we have this application. This company refuses to update their security, and we now are bringing in an insecure piece of data to a secure application. So it is completely broken. We cannot use it. We cannot release this code without running legal risk because it is not in compliance. What do? We officially have no path forward. We cannot get this third party to update their application. They will not do it. We cannot bring in insecure code. We cannot do without this piece of information. What do?
Yes, but you take the information and you build some like DMZ and you still use the interface. You don't change the interface or the API.
Right.
And you take that data in and you do your security check there outside of their domain. And then you fit into your internal application.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But you still do not change the interface.
We did. We changed our API call. We had to update the security on the API call because the call was making to an insecure location. So they didn't have any sort of authentication along the way. So we had to update that, which broke a lot more than I want to admit. We had to redirect our call to a different place. And then we had to build a third-party system in order to grab the data, secure the data, and deliver the data. So we basically built a middleman for it. But we did have a situation where we can't get them to upgrade it. We can't use it. What do? And we did find a way through, which was quite literally exactly what you said. It's building a middleman. We built another piece of software to do it. And it feels like reinventing the wheel, and honestly, it was. And it was not my favorite week.
Yeah, I mean, I'll end on, just kind of a last question for the group. Who here has had the luxury of being able to operate in a perfectly architected app from day one of your software engineering career?
I have. It was a blank document.
How many of you have come into companies and positions where you have to work with code that was written by and large by people who aren't there anymore? Yeah. How easy is it to change that code most of the time? Tends to be really, really difficult. And so, right, to Wren's point, if it's perfectly architected, yeah, we must be avoiding these situations where we have accidental, right, dependency blockers where we can't really move forward without completely changing something about the application. But none of us has that luxury. We're all working with code bases that other people have laid out and architected, and oftentimes we get into situations where it's like, well, yeah, I mean, if I had built it differently, we could absolutely handle this without having to make any change to the interface or to the way that we call to this third party. That would be awesome. But a lot of the time, we just don't have that ability as engineers. We have to look at it and say, it was put together the way it was back in the day. It's going to take a lot of time and a lot of money to go back over this service and try to figure out, is it cost effective for us to patch this? Is it cost effective for us to do it without hurting any other portions of the system? And those are, again, business conversations and not engineering conversations. So the goal of engineering, and I encourage everyone in this room to remember that, is to always be able to say to your product and sales team, yeah, we can make that change. That's always the goal. If you're stuck in a situation where a stakeholder on your team comes to you and asks for a change in your software and you say, that's going to be really difficult. We're going to have to go through every module in the system and remaster it to get that change out. It's going to take a month. You've probably got an architectural issue somewhere.
Now, saying, yeah, we can make that change does not mean, yes, we can make that change right this minute. And it also doesn't mean that it's without cost. It just means it is doable. And if your architecture is intentional, you will run through less of these issues of, oh no, how do we deal with this? Our hair is on fire, hopefully. But it doesn't mean that it will never happen. You cannot predict the future. You can't tell where the industry is going to go. The application that I am moving off of Web App 2 right now is one that Web App 2 was at the time the greatest, coolest thing ever, and it looked like it was going to be around forever, and now it is on the Google graveyard. And so they didn't make a bad decision. They didn't have a poor choice when they were architecting it. They made the best decision for the time, and it's just no longer the best decision. So that's when you have to rethink your architecture, rethink the way that it goes, and rethink what your next steps forward are going to be, and taking the time as a company, and yes, you're watching the dollar signs go up as you're having these conversations, knowing that you're taking your engineers for 2 hours and sitting them down in a room with your product people who are not on a phone call with somebody, not getting those leads out there, not going to conferences, they're sitting in a room and they're talking. Yes, it costs you money, but it's going to cost you a lot less to have that conversation and be intentional with your architecture rather than going back later and going, how can we patch this up and make this work for now?
All right, we're up against time. Does anyone have any broad questions? All right then. Well, thanks everyone for coming over here today. It was great to go through this with you. If you're looking to reach out to either of us, we'll be here for a little while. We're both on the Fingal team. You can find the rest of our team scattered around this hotel somewhere. Thank you all so much for coming and for joining us on our diagrams and listening to us talk a little bit. It's been a lot of fun. Have a great rest of the day. We'll see you around.
Thank you so much.